We're in an ever-changing, fast-paced, hot-wired world, and so we have to sort of be rooted in the past and in an imaginative way to understand our place now. Does that make sense? We just think of all the alphabets we have these days, FOMO, fear of missing out, FOMO, and Black Lives Matter, and artificial intelligence, AI, and BLM. I mean, in this fast-paced, abbreviated world, we have to settle down, read slowly, learn from the past, think about some things together. And books can help us do that. I was talking with Steve Alcrediger just this morning, and he said that he teaches in one of his classes the Brothers Karamazov, the great classic Russian literature, and the Brothers K by James David Duncan, a contemporary novelist, and puts them together in conversation. See, that's sort of the past and the imagination working together. This is like so good. It's an honor to be here with you all in this fast-changing world. Another reason why we need to always read, and that's always been the case, the world's always changing, but we need to read well and widely in this time particularly, is because, as a matter of fact, I don't want to dwell on this, but as a matter of fact, reading habits in American culture is in decline. The NAE, who helps fund this event, just released a study of the last 5 years, they do them every 5 years, study of engagement with the arts. And as part of their study of American engagement with the arts, one piece of that is the engagement with literature. And so they surveyed, 50,000 people or something, a significantly, statistically significant amount of folks, and they found that reading is again in decline as it was the previous time when they did it in 2014 or whatever the last one was. So there is this sort of fast dropping trend of people, even college graduates, even literature majors that graduate from college and don't only read but maybe one novel a year. Poetry is down again. It was a little blurb when it was high a couple of years ago. It went up a little bit, but is now down again. And so the overarching trend of Americans not only not buying books, that's another survey of the bookstore struggles, but not reading books even in the library. So we are in this National Endowment of the Arts study that just came out in sort of depressing territory here. And we know, of course, that our society is frayed. There is polarization, even here in Ottawa County. I've heard some of the things that go on in your community. And so we need some sort of ability to talk better about our cultural polarization. And books and literature is one piece of that puzzle. It's not the only piece, but it is a piece of the puzzle to be a good reader. We'll get to that in a moment. But again, that's not necessarily new. When we opened our store 40 years ago, Martin Luther King Day was not the day yet. It was not a national holiday. My wife and I have a degree of civic activism in our background, and so we were out in the streets organizing and writing to Congress and stuff to try to get Martin Luther King Day a national holiday to honor one of the great Christian leaders of our country. And we began to get the death threats from the KKK under the bookstore. We had a big window of Martin Luther King books in our store window. And we'd live in that building and have little children. And we began to get the death threats under the door. So it's not just here in Ottawa County now where there's polarization and people getting fired and conversations about the right and the left and all this sort of stuff. It's always been that way. And good readers are able to sort of navigate some of that stuff. Does anybody remember the name Dorothy Day? She's again another hero of mine, a Catholic saint and woman from the middle of the 20th century, died in the late 20th century, who served the poor in New York, started a Catholic movement called the Catholic Worker. They didn't own anything, kind of like St. Francis, and they just served homeless people. And she protested war and did all sorts of social justice stuff. But at her heart, she was a prayer warrior and a mystic and a lover of literature. And so there's a famous picture of Dorothy getting arrested with Cesar Chavez, who was in a certain sense the Martin Luther King of the Latino community, working around boycotting grapes and stuff because they were ripping off the farm workers in Southern California, and she would have to stand with them and ends up at 87 years old and gets arrested and is in Time magazine, these kind of things, getting this picture. And she took with her to jail a Russian novelist. So on the edge of service of the poor and dramatic civil disobedience on behalf of organized poor people's labor, she's really motivated to do that because she's reading literature. So I think that's just why I say that the event here is so important, and it's important now, although it's always important. So anyway, I'm not a literary scholar, I'm not an English professor, I'm not a novelist or a poet, I'm just a pretty ordinary guy. I spend too much time on Facebook like many of you do. I like to binge watch my Netflix shows sometimes. I'm a small town, ordinary, independent bookstore owner. As has been said, my wife and I opened Hearts and Minds 41 years ago, and I could talk all night about stories in the book-selling world, customers and people. Eugene Peterson, one of our famous customers. But I come to you tonight not so much to say anything new. I'm going to use that old-fashioned phrase that you've heard, preaching to the choir, because you're here indicates your interest in the big read. And so there is this sense I'm just preaching to the choir. Although it is a big choir, as we know in our book-selling world. We have customers all over the world. We have customers all over the country. And we get remarkable emails almost every day from somebody that's read a book we've sold them the previous month, telling me what they've thought or what they've learned or how they liked it or didn't. So perhaps I'll just be reminding you a bit of things that you already know, things that we believe that if you read broadly and widely that it matters. You're part of a big tribe of people that do this stuff, and so thank you for letting me be here tonight. Again, if I realize that it's really nothing new for you gathered here as we are on a Thursday night in Holland, Michigan, I do want to say that it is important to keep saying this to ourselves. The cultural pressures, particularly technology and the fast-paced way in which we live these days, make it hard to slow down and build time into our schedules to read. We can talk about that in the question and answer. So it needs to be repeated, just like church. You go to church week after week and you say the same thing, in Jesus Christ you are forgiven. Some of us that go to church say that every week. Just because we need to hear it so often. And here again, it bears repeating that books matter, that the printed page matters, that reading matters, and that I might want to say this if I may, that independent bookstores still matter. So we say this to ourselves over and over again, even though it is preaching to the choir. Do you remember a line from an old book? Some of you are young, you may not remember this book from 1943 by Betty Smith called A Tree Grows in Brooklyn. It's a famous book. There's this girl named Francine as one of them, immigrant family. And there's a line in that book that says, as she read, at peace with the world and happy as only a little girl could be with a fine book and a little bowl of candy, and all alone in the house, the leaf shadows shifted and the afternoon passed. And the author says that Francine was the books that she read. Maybe you've had that kind of experience where you're lost in a book for a day, and the leaves, shadows change, and the world shifts outside you, and it's dark, and you're just so lost in that book. I hope you've had that experience. If we were in a church setting, I'd say, do I hear an amen? Amen. But just for fun, I'll do it a different way then. Here's what we'll do. Think for a moment, like Francie in Tree Grows in Brooklyn, of a book that you got lost in. Think just to yourself for a moment of a book that you loved. Maybe the first book you really enjoyed as a kid, or a book that made a difference in your life, or a book that somehow allowed some pieces to come together that profoundly struck you, that you viewed maybe as a gift that just fell into your lap at the right time. Can you think of that book? Call one out. Just say it. Anybody have a favorite book?
Hunger Games.
Thank you.
Moscow.
Oh yeah, that's a great book. Call it out. Wow, a little litany here. What's that?
Western Game.
Oh man.
White Noise.
Boundaries.
Investments and fashions.
Somebody had to say it. I need to get Jamie Smith in here to tell you about it. The internationally acclaimed poet, Padraig O'Tuama, is an Irish poet and a peacemaker, has a forthcoming book coming out from a publishing house up in Grand Rapids, actually, called Urbans. We got an advanced copy of it. It doesn't come out until January. It's one of the reasons I can't retire as a bookseller, because booksellers get these free advanced manuscripts. I'm not going to give that up. So we got this advanced copy of one of the very few people in the world that's seen this book. It's going to be called, Being Home. You're being home. It's It's mostly a book of prayers, a very stylized, poetic kind of praying called collects, and also some essays. And one of the essays that struck me, he tells about being very, very sick. He's got nausea and vertigo and stuff. And he decides to listen on audio to this favorite book of his. It's one of his favorite books ever. It's one of the longest books ever written in the English language, by the way, which shows you something about him. And he writes a line in there that the literature was a form of company. That the language was a companion to him. Isn't that beautiful? That a good book can be comforting when you're ill, and the language can become so familiar. It's sort of reassuring. I've heard it said that one of the reasons we read books, one of the reasons we read at least novels, and other books too, is to discover that we're not alone. You know, you get to that point where you go, what? You too? I thought I was the only one. And then you find a story that's unpacking this same experience that you've gone through, and it begins to make sense in your own life. I mean, I think, by the way, this is not what we're here to talk about tonight, but I think this is a good argument for why public libraries should be well-stocked and diverse. I mean, there's eccentric kids, there's all kind of unique folks out there in whatever situation they're in, minority folks, immigrant kids, kids in a wheelchair, whatever, and you feel like a little alone, a gay, lesbian kid, and then you read a story that's your own story, and you go, oh, I'm not alone. I can name for you, if you want, books and songs. I can tell you about a Sufjan Stevens song, a graduate of Hope College, that saved the life of a young person that I know. Listening to the poetry, or the novel, or the short story, or the Sufjan song that kept him from killing himself. So it matters. It's a matter of life and death that libraries are well stocked and diverse. Books can be our friends. They can bring joy and solace. They can be funny, and they can be hard. I think it was James Baldwin who talked about reading a book, finding a book by a black scholar, that said he felt like reading it was a punch to the solar plexus. Is this where we get it? Baldwin said this one book was like a punch to the solar plexus. So it can be passionate, it can be hard. I mean, I'm sure you've heard this line from Walden, right, from Thoreau, who said, how many people have dated a new era in their life from having read a book? It can be transforming. And again, this isn't new, and it isn't particularly modern. In fact, in the Bible, if you don't mind here at Hope College just for a minute, I'll allude to a Bible story in 2 Kings, I think it's maybe like 23 or something. They're rebuilding the temple. My imagination, I'm not sure this is right, but I imagine that it's after exile. It's sort of like in New York after 9/11, and they're rebuilding the devastated temple, and they're in the building project, and they discover the scrolls, they discover the Torah, they discover a piece of Deuteronomy, for crying out loud, and they stop everything. There's this Jewish festival now where they reenact this year after year after year when they rediscover the book that had been lost. In the Old Testament scriptures in Nehemiah, there's a similar time, and they're reading the scrolls of the prophet Nehemiah, they're rebuilding the temple again, and they need somebody to help them figure it out. They so want to learn that they hire what we like today call Sunday school teachers, and they hang out for days having this Bible lesson because they want to understand the scrolls. So deep in the Western tradition, back to the Christian and Judeo tradition, there's this love of books, there's just passionate books. This morning in a little gathering with some student leaders, I told the story of a great Chaim Potok novel. Potok was a Jewish novelist, lived in Philadelphia. There's 5 or 6 novels that are spectacular. And they're always about sort of Jews and different sorts of Jewish people, conservative Jews and Hasidic Jews, relating to each other, relating to Gentiles, or relating to things that are troubling. Being a psychologist and having to read German after the Holocaust, or being an artist. My name is Ashley Leonard. What a great book. But there's one story in which the Jewish kid takes his Catholic boy friend in to watch their men dancing in a circle with the Torah scrolls. They're dancing. And the Catholic kid said, what the heck is going on? Like, what are they doing? And he says, oh, they're dancing with our book. Don't you dance with your book? It's not a bad question, isn't it? Do we love the printed page? All the things that we've said it can do, provide solace and comfort even to those that are hurting, save our lives for crying out loud. We should value the books like the Old Testament Jews did in 2 Kings 23. I entitled my presentation this big, big hope for the big read because there's sort of two levels of hope, two sorts of kinds of things that can happen when communities read books together. There is indeed this personal hope of each individual reader's experience, the hope of a deeper, richer life, of an interior life, of personal comfort, of discovery, of renewed convictions, of new convictions. Books can be conduits for personal growth, for those who are Christians, for deeper discipleship. This is a big hope. The Apostle Paul knew this too, by the way. It's no accident that one of the last recorded moments in the Apostle Paul's life, he's in jail, he's in Rome, he wants to get to Spain, but he's never going to get there, he's about to die. As an old man in jail, and he writes one of his last letters to a young kid named Timothy, and he orders books. He's just written the New Testament, whether you're a Christian or not. Like, this guy is filled with the Holy Spirit, writing God's Word, one of the geniuses of the first century, a Jewish rabbi himself previously, a brilliant writer, and he's ordering books. He's a reader, right up to the end. He didn't order them from Amazon either, by the way, but that's... We'll talk more about this in a moment, how books can be resources for personal growth and transformation, bread for the journey, so to speak. But I'd like to kind of start tonight by highlighting the second big of my big, big hope. And I'm talking about the hope that a community that reads together will be a better community. That reading widely in communion can help. That phrase, in communion. Dare I use this phrase that's used around here, a theological phrase, that it can lead to reformation. Or the biblical word, shalom. We can become a flourishing community, a community that bears witness to the reform and change that maybe even God wants. If we read together our frayed and polarized culture, I believe this, can be somewhat healed, maybe substantially so. We can experience human connection and spur on the capacity for culture-wide flourishing if we grapple with books together. This is, friends, a big hope. Of course, I'm not the only ones to say this. This is just not some bookseller ranting about my job. The communal nature of big reads in 2 Kings can remind us it's an ancient insight. We gather together around texts. Down through history, it's always been this way. We had great libraries in Egypt, passion for learning when Gutenberg invented the printing press in the 1500s. There's a little publishing house we deal with called Pilgrim Press. It's run by the United Church of Christ, a little Protestant denomination. And their logo on the spine of their books is a printing press. And I asked them once why they had their roots in congregational churches up in New England. But I said, well, because the Mayflower came over with our people, the very first congregational, some of the early colonial Christians that came over in the pilgrimage, and they brought a printing press with them. They're building a new world, and you got to have books. And so to this day, they have that printing press in their offices in Ohio. They came over in one of the first boats. Certainly, even in the colonial period of the United States, during the American Revolution, during the rise of the Republic, pamphlets were passed out. Bestsellers, as we might call them, publishing and printing matter to the formation of our country was ubiquitous. It was assumed that a well-educated and civil and civic-minded constituency, people that are fluent and somewhat well-read, is a necessary kind of condition for civility and democracy. So it's nothing new. A few years ago, a friend of mine named C, goes by C. Christopher Smith, Chris Smith, runs something called the Englewood Review. It's online, really good Englewood Review of books. He wrote just a lovely and powerful book called Reading for the Common Good, How Books Help Our Churches and Neighborhoods Flourish. And Chris found that reading books together in small groups, in his church, and book clubs, but also in the neighborhood where people are not necessarily members of the church, but together they wouldn't come to church if you're having a Bible study or something, but they might come to a book club because everybody's heard of that because of Oprah or whatever. So, they'll go to a book club. So they'll have a book club in the community, And after doing that for a while, they developed a sort of fluency, a sort of language or a grammar, if you will, of how to engage in better conversations. So not only do you get whatever you get out of the book and the art piece as you engage it, but you're learning the skill of civility, of democracy, of learning to listen to each other without exactly realizing it. They became better listeners. In part because when you read a book, you have to sort of suspend disbelief for a while, unless you're a complete arrogant narcissist. You say, okay, I'm going to listen to this guy. This woman's got something to say, I'm going to just listen for a while, see if I agree or not, but you sort of suspend your own opinion or your own, if it's a fantasy novel, disbelief, and you enter into the fantasy realm for a while. Just the act of submission to another, of saying, I'm not the center of the story. You develop what theologians call it the hermeneutics of charity. You learn to listen well, you analyze things in light of what can I learn here. And that's what was happening in Chris's neighborhood, in his urban neighborhood, without even quite realizing it, by listening to the text, listening to the author, submitting to the truth that might be there, and then learning to talk about that with others, which is what the big read does. You talk together about the books. And they grew in what I want to call intellectual hospitality. Sort of just was a byproduct. They weren't trying to get at that, although maybe Chris was. He has another book on talking together well. Intellectual hospitality is rooted in humility, and it's learned from listening, which is one of the things you do when you read a book. You're paying attention to the author. So intellectual hospitality can generate better conversations. So when controversy hit their church, as it did, and as some very hard things began to happen in their urban neighborhood, as it did, they literally found out that readers became community leaders. It sounds like a little cheesy phrase, readers become leaders, but it's true. I believe there's a clear connection between sort of the hosting of ideas and learning to talk about them together, and how they learn to navigate the painful stuff happening in their church and in their community and in their neighborhood. Inexplicable differences and violence and injustice. Civic and civil society is enhanced and strengthened by people that read novels and stories and history and philosophy and graphic novels and memoirs. And note, it isn't quite so much that any one of the books that they read in their books club had a moral to the story exactly, a lesson learned, like a recipe that you would just sort of apply. Rather, they had read widely together, and they sort of just seemed to have a more imaginative approach to life in the world, a way of seeing, a way of leaning into life and listening and encountering others. You know, C.S. Lewis has a book called Experiments in Criticism. I mean, this fairly academic book that he wrote when he was at Oxford Prof. He talked about not using a book, but rather receiving it. Isn't that a nice line? In other words, you just don't grab an idea from an author and say, well, this will work, I can apply it kind of pragmatically, instrumentally, but rather, he uses the word, it's in the Bible actually, interesting word, beholding. You behold a text. You stand, in a certain sense, in awe before it and receive it. So that's much, much better than looking for a quick recipe or a quick fix or a critique of it at first. And that's what good writing and good books, what poems and stories and history and memoir, creative nonfiction can do. It can change our affections. Wendell Berry says it all turns on affection. It shapes our dreams and our visions, our yearnings, our loves, our passions, our values, our ethics, our cares, and our plans. Did you know that there's been research done, and they do this every other year, I think, but there's been research done that comes out the same way every time, that readers, people that read, are more empathetic. Our friend Mary McLaughlin down at college in the South, a whole book on this, how narrative and story can make us more empathetic. And it shouldn't surprise us, really. I mean, you've heard that phrase, you walk a mile in somebody else's shoes, you know. I mean, you enter the story of someone unlike yourself, a person of color, an immigrant, a woman from the 17th century, an hour space person from the future century. You enter into the life of somebody else that's different than yourself, and you're like, oh, so that's what it's like. I mean, how could you not come away reading great, even nonfiction? I mean, I think of just books I've read, like LaJoy and Macy's Dope Sick, which they made into a Netflix show. It's a powerful, thick book. Or Matthew Desmond's award-winning book, Evicted, about homelessness in his city. With a gripping memoir set up in Canada by Arthur Boers, who was a Christian Reformed kid, wrote a book called Shattered, about his abusive relationship with his father, whom he loved. How could you not grow more caring? It's a book that's just came out recently called The Day in the Life of Ahmed Salmer, a Palestinian child that dies in a bus wreck in Israel on the border, and the lack of solving the problem of what to do with the injured kids in the bus, and the Israel-Palestinian situation, about humanizing it in a memoir of this day in the awful life of everybody involved. And more closely to our community here, how can you not become more compassionate and ever care about, in this case, say, the generational sort of epic story of Black Americans, knowing what we know now in our bones from having read Homeland, having met Aficia and Abinia and Akua and Kojo, and her kids that all have those names by every name of the alphabet, and H, who ends up a coal miner in Birmingham. What a chapter. I'll never forget Marjorie and Marcus. I won't give any spoilers if you haven't gotten through the book yet, but the Asante language and Twi and Afante land stuff in the beginning there from the Gold Coast of Africa is a bit complicated, and it is. You guys have these great bookmarkers that show the epic family, who, Gan, Gap, who. Hang in there with it. As one reviewer, Phil Clay, himself a great artist today, said it is both epic and intimate. And he's so great. I have some friends from Ghana, and anyway, what a story. How could it not affect our sense of compassion and empathy? My wife and I, at Hearts and Minds, pretty much staked our lives on this livelihoods, on this big, big hope that readers can become leaders of sorts and act as some kind of a virtuous alternative community that can actually serve like lemons in a loaf. You've heard that reading can change the world. I just believe that. Books have shaped and nurtured and more wholesome and healthy way of thinking and speaking and listening and acting in the world, and we just believe that this can't happen. The cumulative effect of programs like Lakeshore Big Read for adults and children is incalculable. It's just incalculable to know the impact of all this, our social imagination and the shape of our common lives together. In Pennsylvania, we call ourselves a commonwealth, our state, which sounds a little more like legendary than it should, I suppose, because it doesn't work. But our commonwealth together is informed by stories, which Jennifer Holbert calls nourishing narratives. What a great book that is. Her nourishing now, can I say that she's from Calvin College? The nourishing narratives that shape us. I mean, put simply, to quote again my friend Chris Smith's Reading for the Common Good, he says this: the practices of reading and conversation are vital for the process of transforming our social imagination. Part of the human experience is imagining how the world should function. Reading renews and energizes our social imagination. Just a couple of weeks ago, a month ago now, there was one of the leading book events in the world. I would never go to it, but it's called the Frankfurt Book Fair. All the big publishers are there from all over the world. Big deal. Nobel Prize winners and Pulitzer Prize winners show up, and it's a big, big thing for booksellers. And it was a few days or less than a week after the horrific massacre from Hamas of the civilians in Israel. And at this book fair, they were intending to give an award to a Palestinian novelist. And the Frankfurt Book Fair decided days after this horrible massacre that they were not going to give the award to this woman. They didn't exactly not give it to her, they just postponed it. But they decided not to have an award of it at the event. Well, a contemporary philosopher that gets around a bit, Slowjoy Zizek, my daughter now went to the airport and got a picture of him. Zizek was one of the speakers at this thing. He gave a fiery speech expressing his disappointment that they didn't honor the Palestinian writer. And one of the lines in this fiery speech he gave a couple of weeks ago in Frankfurt was that literature, he said, is still the privileged medium to render palpable the deep ambiguity and complexity of the human predicament. Let me read that again. Shizak says that literature is still the privileged medium to render palpable the deep ambiguity and complexities of our human predicament. And now some might want to say, and push back just a little and say that film and music and song and TV and YouTube and documentaries can do this as well. And I want to give a hearty approval to that. I want to yes and say I agree. I'm not sure he's right that it is the privileged and only medium to render palpable the deep ambiguity and complexities. Pop culture can do that as well. So I don't think we need to pit reading culture against pop culture. And we need to be conscientious in nurturing the art of cultural discernment in movies and music as well as novels and plays. However, there has been a provable sort of decline and documented troubling decline, as I started with the NA National Endowment of the Arts survey, a decline in the sort of slow and reflective habits of thought that reading can provide when we develop our habits rather that are mostly shaped by the entertainment media complex. So when we're shaped by the media complex of fast-paced images of entertainment, we sort of lose the skills of slow, careful reading. This is a weighty obstacle, our swimming in the fast streams of digital streams in the waters of our age. That big read projects just have to continue to grapple with. And I might say, as do universities and churches, just the same. We have to address this question of how to be a part of a strategy. Visual artist Marco Fujimura calls it culture care. How we can sort of get to a position where we care for our culture in the digital fast-paced world in which we live and still somehow honor and create the virtues of slow reading, of paying attention. So to help underscore our concern about this great obstacle to reading well, if there's big hope that reading can change the world and people aren't reading as much, how do we get around that? Well, we have to analyze the entertainment industry that keeps us from reading well. And so our bookstore occasionally does workshops around a book called Amusing Ourselves to Death by Neil Postman. Some of you know it. I had an opportunity to meet Dr. Postman, a Jewish media critic that lived in New York City. And my dad had just died, and his dad had just died. And we walked around together and talked. It was amazing after Neil Postman. In this Amusing Ourselves to Death book, he analyzes, just let me say it for a minute, he analyzes, he's a Jew, he's analyzing Christian preaching in the early colonial period, first grade of the Great Awakening, Jonathan Edwards and those young guys. He analyzes the depth of theology and philosophy that ordinary people would listen to these hour-long sermons, and then he jumps to televangelists and the kind of online preaching we hear from TV preachers today. He then jumps to American political history and he looks at the Lincoln-Douglas debates. Remember those? Reading about those? Remember those? Are you there? The Lincoln-Douglas debates where people would sit for hours and listen to arcane, heavy political philosophy about John Locke and that kind of stuff. Ordinary farmers that had not been to college would sit through interesting political discourse for hours. And then Postman says, but in the television era, we have these like publicized debates where it becomes known that the candidates, are more worried about the color of their tie than they are about kind of developing content beyond sound bites. So what happens when we dumb down our religion and our politics in a culture that's largely directed by entertainment and amusing ourselves to death, as he puts it? He wrote a foreword to that book in which he compared, if you're not a literature major, just hang in here, you probably read this stuff in high school, 1984 and Brave New World, right? Two dystopian novels, you've heard about these guys, Orwell and Huxley. I'm going to read from the foreword of Amusing Ourselves to Death, where he says this. He was thinking about how 1984 was about to happen, the real 1984, and we were all selling the book in those years. He says, we had forgotten that alongside Orwell's dark vision, there was another, slightly older, slightly less well known, and equally chilling book, Aldous Huxley's Brave New World. Contrary to common belief, even among the educated, Huxley and Orwell did not predict the same thing. Orwell, in his novel, warns that we will be overcome by an externally imposed oppression. Big Brother's going to take your books, right? But in Huxley's vision, no big brother is required to deprive people of their autonomy, maturity, and history. As he saw it, people will come to love their oppression, to adore the technologies that undo their capacity to think. What Orwell feared would be those who would ban books. What Huxley feared is there would be no reason to ban books, because no one intended to read them. Orwell feared that those who would deprive us of information. Huxley feared those who would give us so much information that we would be reduced to passivity and egoism. Orwell feared that the truth would be concealed from us. Huxley feared that the truth would be drowned in a sea of irrelevance. Orwell feared that we become a captive culture. Huxley feared that we would become a trivial culture, preoccupied with some equivalent of the feelies, the orgy, or the centrifugal bumble puppy. If you read the novel, you know what those are about. As Huxley remarked in Brave New World Revisited, the civil libertarians and rationalists are ever on alert to oppose tyranny, failed to take into account man's most infinite appetite for distraction. In 1984, get this, Huxley added, people were controlled by inflicting pain. In Brave New World, they're controlled by inflicting pleasure. In short, Orwell feared that what we hate will ruin us. Huxley feared that what we love will ruin us. Amusing ourselves to death by Postman is about the possibility that Huxley, not Orwell, was right. That we love our pleasure so much that we amuse ourselves to death. Nobody has to take our books away because we don't want them anyway. Other scholars have analyzed this in helpful ways. Just for the record, Sven Berkitz wrote a seminal book called Gutenberg Elegies, which was beautiful. Marianne Wolf has a book called Proust and the Squid, and a wonderful book called Reader Come Home that analyzes digital reading, what happens when you read online and on computers, digitally with pixels and stuff, what they do to your brain. I'm sure you've heard of Sherry Turkle's Alone Together, the glorious rich work of Andy Crouch and those things. I think of all of those, probably the most important for our generation is called The Shallows by Nicholas Carr. Any of you have heard of this book? Carr was a book reviewer for the Los Angeles Book Review Journal. And he realized, as a professional who read literary fiction, he couldn't read long books anymore. He just sort of was unable to do his job. And he realized it's because he spends all his time reading short snippets of things on Google and hypertext and links. And he said, he wrote an article in the Atlantic called, Is Google Making Us Dumb? It's literally eroding our capacity to think longer thoughts together because we're so fragmented. And he gave up Google and blogs and Instagram and all that stuff for a while. And his capacity to read slowly came back. He did some research in the middle of this. Neurologists can hook stuff up to your eyeballs and watch how your eyeballs work and stuff. And they really literally looked at the neurology of reading. And they found that when people read online as opposed to a printed page, they adapt, without even knowing it, they adapt what's called, the scholars call it the F-scan. They read across the sentence of the page, Then they drop down a couple and they read maybe half the sentence. And then your eye pretty soon is just looking at the left-hand column. And so it's no wonder you don't have the capacity to remember what you've read because you've not really dealt with the text well because you've read it online and the pixels just work your brain that way. It's not to say that all cell phone reading is wrong, but it is just a proven fact that there is kind of a danger neurologically by reading when you're reading the pixels, this F-scan thing. But imagine you're going to do a rare surgery that's going to save your life and your surgeon decides you got to just brush up the medical textbook. But he's been learned and trained in the practices of subliminal reading online. And he does an F-scan. I mean, just imagine. Well, anyway, the shallows by Nicholas Carr. But for all the very pressing concerns about the dangers of these digital devices and our online reading habits and how it's sort of supplanting and eroding the holding and the study of real books, I think one of the greatest obstacles is just our gradual disinterest. Our illiteracy, it's called. Not illiteracy, illiteracy. It's people that can read, but they just don't. Our fast-paced, demanding lives are just too busy, and we've got to think about that together in community. In communities like the Big Read, to figure out how to keep this thing going in this fast-paced, crazy world. I have an old friend named Ken Myers. He has a great audio book. He used to work for NPR, and he just does this thing where he interviews authors. It's all online, fabulous stuff you can listen to. And Ken's an interviewer, a great, gracious interviewer. But years ago, he told the story that he worked at NPR for a while. And he had another colleague who worked at NPR, National Radio, he was a radio guy. And the one guy took a job to go to ABC World News Tonight. His friend left, and they decided to get together for coffee or drink or something like a month later, just to see how his friend was doing. And he said, how do you like your new job? And the guy said, it's good. I like this job, I like his colleagues. He said, he got kind of wistful. And he said to Ken, but you know, when I used to come to work at NPR, everybody was reading books. And everybody was talking about what they were reading about. And everybody was like sort of arguing about stuff and excited. There was this sort of energy in the air because everyone read. He said, you go to work at ABC and nobody reads books. Because everybody's just too busy. You gotta get the show out. Nobody reads books. Kind of wistful. I think that's sort of a parable for our time. There's all sorts of cultural and social obstacles that we're overcoming in our culture to prevent things like the Big Read. I mean, the book banning thing, I'm not going to go on about it, but I will say that. I live in near York, Pennsylvania. The school district right next to us is called Central York. A lady from our church and our bookstore helped select a group of multi-ethnic, beautiful children's books because we have a growing Latino population, lots of African Americans in New York, growing Asian Americans. So we just wanted diverse books showing the variety of kind of books that are out there for kids. And this specialist from our church and our bookstore kind of put it together and came up with lots of books in the school board years ago. And the new school board, a year ago, decided to not ban them outright, but to evaluate a whole bunch of books. Every single book, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds, was either by or about a person of color. It was the most overtly racist political move, and it became a national news story. You probably heard it if you listened to it. So there are issues. Overtly racist, banning of books about a little girl's hair because she was a woman of color, a little child, black girl. And they're going to ban it just because they were afraid about being woke. Well, there was lots of pushback, and bookstores sort of buying books and re-donating them back to the school. And the questions were whether the teachers were allowed to actually use them in their classes. There's obstacles out there. There's issues here in Ottawa County. I know it, and you know it. But there's so many examples of where books have made a difference in people's lives, where they've been liberating. I read a book once called Reading Lolita in Tehran. Lolita's a book I've never read. It's sexual in nature. But this woman in a burqa started a book club in Iran reading this racy English book. It was a transforming read of how this underground subversive movement of reading a novel of a group of women in Tehran. I'll never forget that. Or one of my favorites, a book by Rod Dreher, whose sister is dying in Louisiana. He moves down there to try to help, and things don't go so well. There's family issues. He gets depressed. Goes to a doctor to try to get help from a counselor. And he ends up finding help by reading Dante. The book was called How Dante Saved My Life. It's just a memoir of a guy reading a book that gets him out of his funk. For good or for ill, authors and writers and novels and poets and songwriters can change the world. I mean, just think of in church history, John Wesley's bands and they helped stop slavery and stuff. And you know, John Wesley was the founder of the Methodists. It was a derisive term. They called him a Methodist because he had a method that after he would lead people to Christian faith, he would train them in the ways of discipleship by, guess what? Reading classic books together. And they say, oh, you have a method. It's like, yeah, it's a book club. Oprah didn't make this up. John Wesley opened up the book club. He put bookshelves in his carriage. Maybe the first person to ever do that. Today we got books on tape and stuff in our cars. He wanted to redeem the time and read while he was driving around. Think of William Wilberforce, who's also in Wilberforce was a parliament member trying to stop slavery. And he also started the SPCA, we began on the street because he cared for animals. He started Bible translation projects, but his real heart was to try to stop slavery in England. And he would pass legislation, and he would lose. He would introduce legislation, and he would lose. Year after year after year, and he kept trying to build a movement. He finally realized that culture is sort of upstream of politics. That if he wanted to change the legislation, he had to change the minds and hearts of the people, by which you do through stories. So he recruited novelists like Hannah More, and he got artists involved. Have you ever seen those blue plates? My mom used to have one called Wedgwood plates. They're pale blue porcelain. Some of the ladies collect them, like my mom. The Wedgwood and Josiah Wedgwood was a pottery maker, and Wilberforce got on board. They created these beautiful plates that would have a picture of an African man or an African woman who says, "Am I not your brother? And am I not your sister?" And they would invite people over to fancy dinner parties and fill up the plates with the food, and then the people would eat the food and the picture would appear to them. And it was literally transforming. This was before, video shorts and stuff, before Facebook. It would be transforming that Josiah Wedgwood's porcelain plates changed people's minds about the humanity of Africans. And so the arts and storytellers, Hannah More's novels and poems, began to make an impact. In the United States, think of Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin, one of the most significant novels written by a woman. Or think of Martin Luther King going off to jail carrying Howard Thurman's book with him, his favorite book. One of my prized possessions is a photograph of King going off to jail holding a Howard Thurman book. In my generation, there was a woman named Rachel Carson who lived in Western Pennsylvania, and she realized that the chemicals of DDT that they were putting out, they have similar things they use today, but the DDT stuff was killing the birds and the bees. Joni Mitchell wrote a song about it, but it was her silent spring that changed the world and caused legislation to stop the pollution that was killing the animals. There's so much we can do where reading well can change the world. I don't have too much more time. We're supposed to go an hour and a half. What I'd like to do is just tell you 5 things that I think books, rather than changing the world, can do for you sort of personally. Now, there's cumulative effects to all this, so the public and private interact. And again, as I say this, keep in mind the C.S. Lewis business, that we don't just use a book, but we behold it. So with that in mind, I do want to use them just a little bit. There are some things books can do for us. I got 5 points. Number 1, books can give voice. This business about saying, you too, I don't want to be alone. You can find your own voice in the book of an author. You can discover by reading a book what you come to believe yourself. You sort of get your own self-awareness deeper by, sometimes I'll read a poem or something, and I'll say to my wife, that's what I'm talking about. Like, a poet is gifted by God to use words, or a song, a Bruce Cockburn song or something. I'm like, that song right there, that's what I was trying to say. I didn't have the words to say it, but God has given other people to say it for us, so I find my voice in the voice of the writer, or the author, or the comedian, or the hip hop artist. So artists can help us give voice. To help explain that, I'm going to read 5 little vignettes from a book. Bear with me here, this is really interesting. There's a book called The Word, edited by Marita Golden. Marita is a woman of color, Caribbean in the United States, and she edited a collection of writings of black authors talking about when they learned to read, or when they, in the civil rights movement, were allowed to get a library card, which is a very big deal. We had to fight and die for black people being able to get federal libraries in America. And so there's stories of older writers and younger black writers finding their voice as writers. And she sets up this book by telling her own story. It's a book, she says, the books have marked some of the most important passages of my life and positioned me in continuous dialogue with strangers, the authors, whose work influenced my values, mirrored my inner turmoil, provided me with delight and moments of bliss. These are stories that often we only need a book to tell. So here's 5 vignettes from her life. There are 4. She says this: I am huddled, as I often am as an adolescent, in the attic of our house, seeking isolation, alone time. I am brooding. Oliver Twist, Jane Eyre, Vanity Fair. I am boisterous and shy, moody and misunderstood. But in the attic, none of that matters. Books are a magic carpet I ride to a place outside myself, into worlds seductively strange yet familiar. A classmate at school is as vain as Vanity Fair's Becky Sharp. I have felt in my bone Jane Eyre's self-doubt all too well. I have seen newspaper photographs of children as poor as Oliver Twist. I tremble with anticipation each time I open a book, and I smile with satisfaction when I read the last page. You can see how she's beginning to sort of find her place in the world, understanding that there's poor children out there, just like she read about in Oliver Twist. That she in her own heart has self-doubts, and she understands that because she read it in her novel. It's 1968. I have discovered that black people live in books and have done things momentous and historic in the world. Malcolm X, Martin Luther King, and Bobby Kennedy are dead, made martyrs by assassins' guns. My faith in America has been cremated and cast to the winds. In my grieving, I turn to stories that complete the history barely begun in my classes at school. Slave riots, W.E.B. Du Bois, Timbuktu, Nat Turner, Bessie Smith, Ida B. Wells. Books turn me bitter. Then they make me proud. And then they make me brave, putting flesh and blood in the bones of a past that my Afrocentric father kindled for me in spurts. Books make me a black woman. She's learning in her own identity who she is as a black woman, as a great-great-great-granddaughter, so to speak, of Ida B. Wells, because she's read about that in books, and the give and take between these authors have made her bitter, and then make her brave, and then help her understand who she is. Isn't that beautiful stuff? Then she writes, I am weeping, too distraught to continue. I cannot imagine actually completing the text. Halfway through Beloved, Toni Morrison's meditation on the price some of us will pay to be free, I am torn asunder, speechless. I am utterly amazed by the terrible beauty and grandeur of this tale. My tears have been shed in Auschwitz, on the middle of slave passage, by rape victims, men dying in trenches, children lit by the fires pierced in. Yet in the end, the tears leave me replenished, fortified with a courage I have never known. I open the book, and I know I can bear it. I don't know if any of you have read Beloved. Hard stuff. But it gave her courage. As a Christian bookseller, we carry all kind of fiction and sell all kind of music that we like. And customers sometimes say, oh, you really shouldn't carry those books. They're just so dark. They're hard. And then they quote this verse in Philippians that says, whatever is good, whatever is faithful, whatever is beautiful, think on these things. Some of you other Christians know that verse. But in that little line, the very first word is whatever is true. Whatever is good, whatever is faithful, think on these things. We live in a very broken world, folks. This stuff is not untrue. My friend Steve Garber always quotes the Southern writer Walker Percy, who said, bad books always lie. And they lie most about the human condition. These saccharine stories, some of them written by religious publishers, where somebody finds God and everything turns nice in the end. It's not true. Toni Morrison is a true author. And it's hard. And it made this woman weep. And at the end of the day, she gets courage. New courage to live by reading this hard, artful work. Check the whole work and stuff about that in her own book. And then she writes this: my marriage has become a prison. I am seriously considering divorce and find myself reading Madame Bovary, Gustave Flaubet's Ode to Illusion, Fleeting Romance, Marriage, and Adultery. But because I love life more than the novel's heroine Emma Bovary does, and I have a child to live for, unlike Emma, there will be no suicidal exit from my door. Still, listen to this. Emma Bovary knows more about me at this moment than anyone else. She alone knows the perimeter of the tomb my life has become. In this, my darkest hour, this fictional character is my best friend. I've read that already to people, and they say, that's a shame. And I guess in a sense it is. We need friends, we need pastors, we need spiritual directors, we need mentors, we need teachers. Yes, we need real community. But there are some times that only an author who's gifted with this gift of words can understand the perimeter of the tombs that our lives have become. And so when she says this author is my best friend, I get it. Maybe some of you. Well, that was the first thing. To give voice is what I call it. The second thing is create empathy. We've already talked about that a little bit. I mean, some great memoirs. One of my favorites is Just Mercy by Brian Stevenson, a man I esteem greatly by his work serving poor incarcerated people who are often imprisoned unjustly. They just didn't do it, but they got all kind of crummy lawyers, free lawyers that the government gives them, and they end up in jail for crimes they didn't do. And Brian investigates that in his book, Just Mercy. Maybe you've seen the movie. It's really good. One of the characters in Just Mercy is Anthony Ray Hinton, and he has a book called The Sun Does Shine. In Just Mercy, Brian's book, Hinton is one of the prisoners, and he has the most horrendous, stupid, racist juries. Stuff that ought to be thrown out in any state. Brian said, oh, well, that'll be thrown out. That's just so obviously wrong. Your case will be taken care of. We'll get you out. And case after case, Hinton keeps going back to jail by judges that won't follow the law and racist attorneys, and it's just a mess. And in that book, he doesn't get out of jail. It's one of the sad parts of Just Mercy. Well, ends up, the story continued, and Brian helps Hinton ongoing and does get him out finally. And so Hinton writes his own book. What a beautiful, inspiring book, how anyone can not appreciate the lives of the incarcerated after reading either of those two books. In Hinton's book, there's a story, he's on guys on death row. And they finally convince, after years, they convince the guards to let them in a book club. And they can't all sit together. They have to shout out at each other. And they all get this book. They all get the book for free from the library or whatever. And they start reading a James Baldwin book called Go Tell It or Not. The couple of pages of Hinton in prison, reading with other death row prisoners, this James Baldwin text is some of the best writing I've ever read. You can't help but grow some degree of empathy for others when you read that kind of stuff. Maybe you've had stories like that. But it can give voice and help us find ourselves. Books can help create empathy. They can also, thirdly, help us find a sense of place. One of the problems, the ubiquitous, fast-paced problems that we mentioned, this obstacle of the digital culture, is that tends to make us nomads. We tend to live in what one scholar calls the geography of nowhere. You know? We don't have roots. We don't live anywhere. In fact, in Stephen's recently republished book called Beyond Homelessness, they talk about guys that have homes all over the country. They have houses all over the country. But they don't fit in anywhere. They don't actually belong. They have no home. Even though they got houses galore. And there may be some people that actually are houseless, but they've got a network of people. They got church friends. They got others that hang in there with them. They got their back. They have a home even if they don't have a house. Well, anyway, in this culture of displacement in which we live, where we're not grounded and rooted in a sense of place, I think books can help us learn to love and be empathetic, not just about other people, but about places. And I'm convinced, Eugene Peterson, our own customer, used to say, the Bible talks as much about land and places as it does people and souls. That where you live matters as much in the Bible about who you are. It's really true. And so a sense of place comes through Willa Cather and her commitment to Nebraska and the Great Plains. It comes through the New Agrarians. It comes from Wendell Berry and his story in Kentucky. Emily Dickinson, Amherst, Massachusetts, right? Robert Frost, New England. J.D. Vance in the Rust Belt. One of my favorite writers is Michael Perry from up around Wisconsin. He's fabulous. I mentioned J.D. Vance in the Rust Belt. My favorite Rust Belt writer is David Giffords from Akron, Ohio. His book called All the Way Home is one called The Hard Way on Purpose. People in scrappy Rust Belt. He lives in Akron, Ohio. Michael Perry's a farmer in Wisconsin. I don't know if I know any great writers from Michigan. Hemingway was up around maybe. But But I listened to that Sufjan Stevens album called Michigan. Right there you go. My friend Gail Hefner and Dave Warner's up in Grand Rapids have a book coming out of the University of Michigan Press next year called Reconciliation in a Michigan Watershed. They've got students up there at Grand Rapids to work on the watershed of the Plaster Creek. It's so polluted because of all the pollution the farmers putting in the Jump River. And they've been spending years replanting things and doing ecological wisdom for this community, working with zoning boroughs all up and down the river. It's quite a story. Of course, it's got a native language name. It's not really called Plaster Creek. And so the restoration of Plaster Creek is a book called Reconciliation in the Michigan Watershed. Books can help us fall in love with a place, which I'm convinced is so very real. Fourthly, books can help build our capacity for wonder, for awe, for curiosity, which leads to gratitude, I think. Barbara Brown Taylor has a book called Altars in This World. She goes, you can't go anywhere without bumping your shins on them. God's altars are everywhere. I appreciate nature writing a lot. Writers like Terry Timmis Williams or Kathleen D. Moore is one of my favorites, who can just take you into the wilderness and write about it beautifully. Brady Sweetgrass comes to mind, a very, very children's books do that too. There's a woman named Natalie Perkins, whose kids' books I like a lot. And she wrote a book this past year about why adults should read kids' books. Gary Schmidt, Barbara Patterson, and all that kind of stuff. As Natalie Perkins says, children's fiction helps us refine things that we may not even know were lost. Reading it as adults takes us back to a time when new discoveries came daily, and while the world was colossal, and before the imagination was trimmed and neatened. Not a good line. When you were a kid, before your imagination was trimmed down, the world was colossal. And so reading kids' books can help you do that again. Angela Mott is a favorite memoirist of mine. She said when she was growing up, a group of teenagers found hope in reading books together. She called it an oasis. And one of the things she said is that learning to read helped us get blissfully lost in resonant works where we could rest or gape or laugh with recognition. I love that line, gape, that word gape. You can learn to gape, your mouth falls open. We think of gaping wounds, but gaping can also be a posture of awe, of wonder, of understanding the beauty of this world. Allow me to read just a beautiful piece of writing that illustrates the glory of language, the joy of delight of just reading and writing, because we don't have to just be gaping at nature, at creation, but we can gape at the beauty of good words. Mainline Protestant preacher and memoirist and novelist was a guy named Frederick Buechner, and a collection of his sermons is called Secrets in the Dark. And another author named Brian McLaren wrote a foreword to his book. And this is just a line from Brian's foreword to this collection of sermons. Brian's both a preacher and a writer. Listen to what he says. He says, people who are afflicted with the twin passions of preaching and writing will probably agree that each benefits the other. For example, in writing, when you slowly and painstakingly fold a clever crease in syntax, when you layer and lean parallelisms upon one another just so, when you learn to signal your logical connections with sturdy connection words like indeed, or however, or for example, you practice skills that are likely to sneak out when you preach, to your surprise and your hearers alike. And similarly, preaching can't help but teach you something about writing. You learn to feel the rhythm of a sentence. You imagine actual readers and counting your words in real time. You learn to simplify, which is harder than it looks. You learn to write in a whisper, maybe, to romance your readers with a tiny scrap of punctuation, just as you might do with a gesture or a sigh when you preach. In fact, if you practice enough writing and preaching, and if you're blessed with an extraordinary natural aptitude from the start, you have the chance of spiraling into greatness. You may even excel beyond that and become further beaten. He says, I have no desire to analyze what made Buechner's writing and preaching so extraordinary. Neither I want to take account of Bob Dylan's raspy mystique, the peculiar beauty of a rainbow trout in a ripple, or a thunderstorm's magnetic terror. I just want to enjoy them. They all knock me out of analysis and smack me clear into pleasure and awe. We can be smacked clear into pleasure and awe by good writing, just like we can by our little child. And lastly, books can help us, and we could spend all night on this, but we won't. Books can help us ask the deepest questions about meaning, about reality, truth, about goodness, about religion, about ethics, about God, right? I mean, you're reading Homecoming, right? I mean, I rest my case. And her sequel, that, by the way, Transcending Kingdom, and you could use that in the big read next time. What a book! So the relationship of faith and science, and God in the United States. Holly Woodway has a book called Tales of Faith, looking at medieval literature, ancient stuff, and how you can do that to help people understand the deepest things about God. She has a first chapter in there, Holly Woodway does, called Lead with Beauty. That the best way to get people into the deepest conversations about the meaning of life and God and all the rest is to lead with beauty. She says this: literature can help the truths of faith to become more fully assimilated by the imagination and grasped by the intellect and felt by the emotions. In other words, the search for truth, according to Holly's explanation here, is that it is multidimensional. It's holistic. And a good story then can, as Emily Dickinson put it, tell its slant. It can come at you from the angle, and you can literally feel it. It engages you literally in your body. Writing that isn't cheap or propaganda is necessarily complex and complicated. One of our favorite books in recent years is Daniel Niere's autobiographical kids book. I hope some of you have read it, Everything Sad is Untrue. And in that book, he's a Persian by ethnicity. He was a Christian. His mother was an underground church leader in Iran, and he had to escape the country. And he ends up as a kid, as a 10-year-old in Oklahoma. Only person of color in his school is an immigrant, and he's trying to explain who he is as an immigrant to these Oklahoman kids. Now, he's Iranian. He's a Persian. Scheherazade, 1001 Nights, he's a storyteller. And there's a point where he's asked to explain who he is, and he starts 2,000 years earlier. And the kids are like, what? And he's telling mythic stories about, you don't even know if they're true, and Scheherazade. And they're like, just tell us where are you from? He's like, oh. Finally, at one point, the teacher says, so, Daniel, you've lost the plot. And this is what Daniel says back, that she is, to the reader, she is beholden to a Western mode of storytelling that I do not accept. Sprawling and convoluted as that may seem, the ode to the power of storytelling will have you in tears by the end, and wondering, it'll have you gaping about whether everything sad can be made untrue. You'll wonder about the truths of the universe. The title, of course, is drawn from Tolkien and his long journey back in England. Let me close with one more example. Can I do that? Can I read one more thing? My book sell. All I know to do is read people books. Story time, kids. Eugene Peterson was mentioned in my introduction. Eugene Peterson has a collection of essays in which he writes about a whole bunch of stuff, and a couple of chapters about his love of books. He was a pastor, translated that paraphrase of the Bible called The Message. Maybe some of you have heard that. Grew up in Montana, fascinating story. And Wayne Collier from Western Seminary wrote a definitive biography about him. Well, anyway, he talks here about how reading a novel affected his own work as a pastor. He happens to be interested. But he said the first book on pastoral care that meant anything to me personally or vocationally was in James Joyce's novel. Have any of you read that? Don't even try. Sorry. One of the weirdest books ever. 2/3 of the way through this meander of a narrative, I saw that I was what I could be doing, should be doing, in my rounds as a pastor, going into homes, going into the hospital, meeting people, talking with them on the street. Before Ulysses, I never looked on this part of my world as particularly creative. I knew that it was important, and I accepted that it had to be carried out, whether I felt like it or not. But except for the occasional activities, it was not very interesting. Nearly everything else I did, preaching and praying, writing and teaching, put far greater demands on my mind and imagination and spirit, and pulled the best out of me, and pushed me to my limits. But making small talk with someone around the water fountain, calling on a lonely old woman, visiting a man with a hospital in the hospital, these were more or less routine functions that I just did. I did them satisfactorily with a modest investment of tact, compassion, and faithfulness. So it was, until I wrote Ulysses. At about page 611, an earthquake opened a fissure at my feet, and all my assumptions of ordinariness dropped into it. All those routines of pastoral care suddenly were no longer routines. Leopold Bloom, the Ulysses of James Joyce's story, was a very ordinary man. There was no detail in his life that was distinguished, unless it was his monotone ordinariness. Dublin, the town where he lived, was a very ordinary town, with nothing in it to set it off except its depressing ordinariness. A colorless, undistinguished human being in this colorless, undistinguished town provides the contents of the novel. James Joyce narrates a single day in the life of this Dublin Jew, Leopold Bloom. Detail by detail, Joyce takes us through what happens in a single day of his life, a day in which nothing of note happens. But as the details accumulate, observed with such acute, imaginative care, the realization begins to develop that, common as they are, these details are all uniquely human. Flickers of recognition signal memories of the old myth, Homer's grand telling of the adventure of Greek Ulysses, as he traveled all the country to experience impossibility and finally found himself. Peterson says, I woke up. Joyce woke me up to the infinity of meaning within the limitations of an ordinary person in an ordinary day. Leopold Bloom, buying and selling, talking and listening, eating and defecating, praying and blaspheming, is mythic in the grand manner. The 20-year voyage from Troy to Ithaca that Homer's Ulysses took us is repeated every 24 hours, ending one's life, if we only have the eyes to see it. I just think that this is amazing. That a dense, complicated book about an ordinary guy could transform one of the most important pastors of the 20th century, who goes on to write scads of books about the significance of God's presence in our ordinary life. Books that you don't think are necessarily religious, like this postmodern James Joyce book, can be the book that God uses, through his common grace, to help us all come alive. To wake up, to gape in wonder. I've got more for you. Let's call it a night until we have some conversation. Big hope for a big read. You guys are doing the work, getting the books out there. I'm so grateful to be here. What can we do to have a little conversation? Questions, anybody? Shout them out.
I can give you a mic if you have a question. Please raise your hand.
About anything I said, or about books, or your own story of books and loving, and the hope we can find in why reading matters. Anybody? Please. Please, go ahead.
I don't think I need to So, I have a question written down. I just read a book by Sarah Casey, who we mentioned, the author, Readability later on. And she talks about how the church ways of opposition and sacrifice with your enemy. Why do you think that people are so afraid of literature and empathizing with their enemy for books?
Great question. She's asking, the woman who wrote Reading Lolita and Tehran has a question about enemies, about reading books that would humanize your enemy, and why are people afraid of that? one of the number one questions of our time. Why are we afraid of our enemies? And why do we not want to see them as human? Why do we want to ban books? Why are people afraid of reading books about people that are different than yourself? In her condition, in the Middle East, there's a certain dynamic going on. But I think more generally, people are, we're human. And so we have fears. And we've got fears of enemies. And so instead of like the radical biblical wisdom of turning your enemy into a friend, you want to conquer your enemy. You want to defeat your enemy. Non-violence, Martin Luther King, you say, I don't want to defeat my enemy, I want to make him my friend. That's how you defeat your enemy, is you befriend them, as Christ would. And so that's one model. The other model is you defeat them. Well, you can't defeat somebody in war, certainly, if they're human like you. And so literature that opens up the humanity of other people has this subversive sense of disturbing the politics of hatred and militarism. That's why governments ban books. One of the books that America banned back during World War I was called Johnny Get Your Guns. Have you heard that by Dalton Trumbo? Dalton Trumbo was a left-wing guy, was in there with McCarthy years and so forth, but he wrote this book about a World War I guy whose arms were blown off, legs were blown off, he couldn't hear, he couldn't see anymore. All he could do was like communicate with thumping. And he could do this sort of, and he pretty soon they took him around. And he would do these anti-war messages. It was one of the most powerful books I've read in my life. And he was banned by the US government. Because they said if people really hear him of the horror of war, they won't want to go to war anymore. And we can't have that. So the guy was one of the early cases of America banning the book. Because it treated victims of war as humans. So that's a really good question from a really good author, but it's complicated. I'm not sure why people are so afraid, but they are. But I think that is what's behind a lot of the book banning things, is we're so worried that something's going to change in our world that we think is wrong, that we don't want to hear the stories of other human people. Other human people. Whether they're gay or lesbian or whatever. There's people that, and so school boards go crazy. And they start banning just books. Interestingly, I'll just say this real quick too. Interestingly enough, some people have like bumper stickers and stuff that fight book banning, saying, ideas or art isn't dangerous. Don't ban anything. It's not that bad. I think it is dangerous. It's subversive. It can change your world. And that's why we should take it seriously and receive it and behold it. We should be honoring and help and receive it. But it's not because it's safe, it's because it's not safe. It's like the lion in Narnia. Safe, not safe. But yeah, thank you. Anybody want to buy a bookstore? Anybody want to go into the bookstore business? We talk about this stuff all day long with people. Anybody else? Please, question.
Do I need a mic or no? So it's my goal to open a bookstore. It's my goal to open a bookstore and coffee shop one day. What would you say is the most rewarding part of opening a bookstore?
The most rewarding part. I'll tell you what the least rewarding parts are. No, wait, I don't have 5 hours. The most rewarding part is the stuff I'm talking about. The books make a difference in people's lives and you see it, whether it's the individual stuff or the cultural stuff. We sell books to individuals that just come to find God, or they come to find healing in their marriage, or they just kind of piece together their own sense of vocation. Books that help you kind of understand a career area or something. And so all kinds of books, fiction and nonfiction, can just change people's lives, and we see it all the time. Not as much as we would wish, because sometimes you don't know. But then you hear years later, when we were announcing this thing on Facebook yesterday, a young lady wrote a Facebook comment to the big read poster on Facebook and said, I learned to read when I was a girl coming in your store, and now whenever I read a book, I think about you. I haven't seen this woman in 40 years, but she thinks about us when she reads a book, so that's rewarding. The personal connection with an author or a reader, but also the more public stuff. I mean, we've sold books in prisons. We've sold books that have helped agitate for social change. We've sold books to people that have helped with immigration projects and stuff. And so you begin to see cultural transformation when people are reading together. I mean, I mentioned William Wilberforce and stopping slavery and getting Hannah More together. They finally moved in together. They realized if they're going to grapple with big ideas, they needed to live together. They were mocked as a sect, like a cult. It's where the Wimbledon tennis courts now are. It was the Clapham part of town. And they all moved in together. A group of these Christians that were artists and thinkers and writers, and they had this sort of writers collective that was ultimately trying to stop slavery. I mean, we've seen things like that too. So when you sell books that can help a person, or you sell books that can change the world, that's so rewarding. You know, books make a difference, so thank you. Good luck to you. Let's talk.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Are there any books, like all the disinformation and misinformation talk, are there any books that you would not sell at your bookstore?
Oh, my. Well, because we're an independent bookstore, we carry whatever we want. So there's a million books we don't carry, just because we don't feel like it. I mean, or I don't know about them, or I just don't think they're great. So, yeah, there's all sorts of books that we just choose not to order. But if a customer wants us to order them, then you can do one of two things. I mean, we're people of faith. If somebody wants to order a book on the occult, like I hate the devil, and I really don't think we should mess with Satanism or the occult or Ouija boards or any of that crap. I'm pretty traditional on those things. And so if somebody wants to buy a book on the dark sciences, I'll try to talk them out of it. There's all kind of right-wing political stuff that's just awful out there, that's dishonest. But if I tell a customer, no, this is just wrong, I lose them as a friend and as a customer. And so I'd rather order the book for them and have a conversation about it, if it's possible, and keep that relationship open. So I'll special order all kind of stuff. I hold my nose and do it. Plus, we need money, I'll be honest. I mean, we can't afford to send everything. But the question of how you guide people pastorally, the algorithms at Amazon will do that for you. But an independent bookstore cares about your customers, and so we want to kind of create a conversation, almost like a teacher would. I'm not a professor, but kind of like a teacher would try to weave together a way of mentor or guide a reader into better books. And if you say, no, I'm not carrying that, I'm not getting that, go to some pagan store and get it, then that person will be lost in the relationship. So I'd rather order a book that I don't care for, and who knows, maybe it's not as bad as I think it is. So I have to have an open mind too. But yeah, books that we choose not to carry, books that we hate, books that we refuse to carry because they're evil. But most of the time, I'd rather keep the relationship open and say, I'll order this book, I'll sell it to you, let's talk about it. Or sometimes I'll say, okay, I'll buy you this one if you read this one too. And then come back and tell me what you think. So I give away more good books because of people bad. Some of these authors that I like, I've given their books away to counter the bad books that customers are buying. So yeah, it's kind of a funky thing, but that's a great question. So the ethics of daily selling, yeah, it's complicated.
One more question?
What are you reading right now?
A bunch. Transcendent Kingdom, which is not really the sequel to Homegoing, but it's the same writer and some of the same story. I'm in the middle of that right now. I'm about that third way through. So that's a novel I'm reading. I'm reading a memoir. I'm reading a memoir right now. I'm actually rereading it. It's called Where the Waves Break by Tyson Mosenbacher. Is anybody know the singer-songwriter?
I just read that book. New Western Math.
It's a great book. He's a singer-songwriter, acoustic guy. He's traveled with Suki on the town already. The singer-songwriter got in California, and he goes on a hike when his mother dies. He has her ashes, and he decides he's going to hike a trail from Southern California up to Northern California. So it's his memoir of hiking on this trail, trying to figure out what he's going to do with this. Did you enjoy it?
It's pretty good.
Yeah, I enjoyed it a lot, but I'm reading it the second time for a complicated reason. But I'm reading that. I'm reading a bunch of theology books and philosophy books and I'm reading a bunch of things. I do a newsletter called Book Notes. It comes out every week, where I list a handful of books, either just new books we get at the store or themes. Some I'm interested in, I'll do 10 books on the same topic. And so I'm always reading books for those, but I kind of skim them so I can just describe them to customers. See, I'll be honest with you, as a bookseller, I got to read stuff so I can tell people about them. And then I read stuff that I want to read for myself. It's just like a teacher, you have to read books for your course preparation, but then you also want to read a book for yourself. And so I'm reading books for myself, and then I'm reading books for that I'm going to write about. And then I have friends that send me books that they want me to read, and I don't really want to read them. It's just still on it. Sorry, you know who you are. And they got to because they're friends, and they send you their manuscript, and you have to write about it. So yeah, I'm reading a ton of stuff. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Byron. We have a bookstore display in the back if you want to buy any big read merch and the books.
Yeah.
And please come to our God Jesse Dr. Ernest Cole from the English department. That'll be in Jack Miller Concert Hall at 7 p.m. on Monday. So thank you guys all for coming. Appreciate it.